The silence in Providence Municipal Court broke at exactly 9:47 a.m. when the courtroom doors swung open. Eleanor White, 80 years old with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, walked slowly toward the defendant's table, her weathered hands gripping a worn leather purse. She wore a simple floral dress, the same one she'd worn to church every Sunday for the past 6 years. And her eyes, though tired, held a quiet dignity that comes only from decades of life lived with grace. Across the aisle sat Marcus Rothwell, 41 real estate developer and CEO of Rothwell Properties. His custom Brioni suit cost $8,000. The Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, $280,000, caught the fluorescent lights as he scrolled through his phone. 3 attorneys flanked him, each carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly pension. Before we dive into what happened in that courtroom, if you believe in justice and want to support a new channel dedicated to sharing these powerful stories, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Every subscription helps us bring more of Judge Caprio's wisdom to light. Judge Frank Caprio entered, and the courtroom rose. At 79, with 37 years on the bench, he'd seen thousands of cases. But something about the scene before him, the elderly woman with trembling hands, the smirking developer checking his watch, made his eyes narrow slightly. Case number 2024 CV 18793, the clerk announced. Rothwell Properties LLC versus Eleanor White. Plaintiff seeks $25,000 in damages for unlawful retention of property. Rothwell's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Douglas Chen, stood. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case. Mrs. White was lawfully evicted from apartment 3B at 247 Waterman Street on December 23rd. She returned to the premises 2 days later without permission, constituting trespassing and unlawful retention. We seek damages, plus court costs. Judge Caprio looked at Eleanor. Mrs. White, do you have representation? No, Your Honor. Eleanor's voice was soft but steady. I can't afford a lawyer. My pension is $100 a month. Tell me what happened, Caprio said, leaning forward. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened a manila folder. Inside were photographs, her hands, her granddaughter's drawings, family pictures spanning decades. I lived in that apartment for 42 years, Your Honor. My husband Raymond and I moved there in 1982. Our rent was $680 a month. We raised our 2 children there. Raymond died in our bedroom 7 years ago in the bed we'd shared since 1963. Marcus Rothwell yawned. Judge Caprio noticed. Mr. Rothwell, am I boring you? Not at all, Your Honor, Rothwell replied smoothly. I'm simply wondering why we're indulging in a history lesson. This is a business matter, not a therapy session. Continue, Mrs. White, Caprio said, his voice measured. On November 15th, I received a notice that Mr. Rothwell had purchased our building for $4.2 million. The notice said we had 30 days to vacate. Your Honor, there were 34 families in that building. Most of us had lived there for over 15 years. Mrs. Chen on the 2nd floor is 86. The Rodriguez family has 3 children under 10. She pulled out a document with shaking hands. The notice said 30 days, but Rhode Island law requires 90 days for tenants who've lived somewhere over a year. When I tried to explain this to the property manager, he said their lawyers found a loophole in the original lease agreement from 1982. What kind of loophole? Caprio asked. Attorney Chen stood. Your Honor, the original lease contained a month-to-month conversion clause after the first year. Technically, Mrs. White has been on a month-to-month tenancy since 1983, which only requires 30 days' notice under Rhode Island General Law 34 to 1837. A technicality on a 42-year-old lease, Caprio said quietly. Go on, Mrs. White. Eleanor's voice cracked. On December 23rd, at 6:15 in the morning, there was banging on my door. I was in my nightgown. It was still dark outside. 4 men from Summit Eviction Services were there with a police officer. They said I had 15 minutes to gather essentials. She wiped her eyes. Your Honor, 15 minutes to leave a home of 42 years. I grabbed some clothes, my medications, my purse. I asked if I could pack my photo albums, 60 years of marriage, pictures of Raymond, my children's baby photos, drawings from my grandchildren. They said no. Personal items would be placed on the curb, and I had 24 hours to retrieve them before disposal. It was 12 degrees below zero that morning, Eleanor continued. Christmas Eve morning, they put my belongings in garbage bags and threw them on the sidewalk. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, filmed it on her phone. My wedding china, service for 12, a gift from Raymond's mother, shattered on the pavement. Photo albums from 60 years of marriage got wet from the snow. Little did anyone know what Judge Caprio would uncover in the next few minutes. Where did you go? Caprio asked gently. St. Mary's Shelter on Broad Street. I spent Christmas Eve and Christmas Day there. My daughter Karen, she's a nurse, works 2 jobs. Tried to find us an apartment we could afford together. But everything in Providence costs $400 or more now. On her salary and my pension, we can barely manage food and her children's expenses. And December 25th? The day you supposedly trespassed? 2 days after the eviction, Karen borrowed her friend's car. We went back to gather what was left of my belongings. Most had been thrown away, but we found some photo albums in a dumpster. We were there maybe 20 minutes. That's when Mr. Rothwell's security confronted us. Marcus Rothwell finally spoke directly. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is wasting the court's time. Mrs. White had legal notice. She failed to vacate. She then trespassed on my property. Whether she lived there 42 days or 42 years is irrelevant. Property rights are property rights. Property rights, Judge Caprio repeated slowly. Mr. Rothwell, tell me about this building. What are your plans for it? Rothwell shrugged. Demolition begins March 1st. The land is worth more than the structure. I'm building a mixed-use development. Retail on the ground floor, luxury condos above. Studio apartments starting at $385,000. And the 34 families? Not my concern, Your Honor. I gave legal notice. What they do after that is their problem. This is business. If Mrs. White can't afford to live in Providence anymore, perhaps she should consider relocating. Ohio has very affordable housing, I understand. The courtroom gasped. Eleanor's daughter, sitting in the gallery, put her head in her hands. If Judge Caprio's compassion moves you, like it moves millions of others, show your support by subscribing to our channel. We're just starting out, and your subscription means everything. Judge Caprio removed his glasses slowly, cleaning them with deliberate care. In his 37 years on the bench, he'd developed a particular expression, calm on the surface, but anyone who knew him recognized the storm building beneath. Mr. Chen, he said quietly, I'd like to see the original eviction notice, the purchase agreement for the property, and all correspondence with the tenants. I'd also like to see Mr. Rothwell's business license and any permits filed for the development. Your Honor, this case is simply about the $25,000 in damages. I'll decide what this case is about, Caprio interrupted. The documents, please. For the next 11 minutes, the only sound in the courtroom was the rustle of papers as Judge Caprio read. His expression grew darker with each page. Finally, He looked up. Mr. Rothwell, according to these documents, you own 2,400 residential units across Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. Rothwell Properties is one of the largest landlords in the region. And according to this permit application, you received $12 million in tax incentives from the City of Providence in 2021 under the Affordable Housing Development Act. The terms required you to build at least 200 affordable housing units with rents capped at $850 for a two-bedroom apartment. How many of those units have you completed? Rothwell shifted slightly. The project is still in development phases. That's not what I asked. How many units have you completed in 3 years? Attorney Chen stood. Your Honor, that's a separate matter. How many? Caprio's voice cut like a blade. None, Your Honor, Rothwell admitted. But we have plans. You took $12 million in taxpayer money designated for affordable housing and built nothing. Meanwhile, you're evicting 34 families from one of the few remaining affordable buildings in the city. Caprio shuffled through more papers. And this is interesting. According to the Rhode Island Department of Business Regulation, Rothwell Properties has 78 violations for tenant rights abuses over the past 5 years. Illegal evictions, unsafe living conditions, security deposit theft, harassment of rent-stabilized tenants. The confidence in Rothwell's posture began to crack. But let's talk about this eviction specifically, Caprio continued. Rhode Island General Law 34-18-16.1 requires that eviction notices be delivered by certified mail or hand-delivered with a witness signature. Mrs. White, how did you receive your notice? It was taped to my door, Your Honor. There was no signature, no certified mail receipt. Caprio looked at Chen. So the notice was improperly served. That alone invalidates the eviction. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I'm not finished, Caprio said. Rhode Island General Law 34-1815 states that no eviction can take place without a court order, even with proper notice. Mr. Chen, do you have a court order authorizing this eviction? The silence answered the question. You don't, because you never filed for one. You used an expired lease technicality and an improperly served notice to conduct an illegal eviction. Caprio's voice rose slightly. And you deliberately chose December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. Because you knew legal aid offices would be closed, making it nearly impossible for these families to get emergency legal help. Rothwell stood suddenly. Your Honor, I don't appreciate these accusations. My attorneys assured me everything was legal. Sit down, Mr. Rothwell. The command was quiet but absolute. Rothwell sat. There's more, Caprio said, holding up another document. This is the property deed. You purchased 247 Waterman Street on November 1st. Rhode Island Law 34-18-46 requires new owners to honor existing leases. Even month-to-month tenancies cannot be terminated without just cause under rent control ordinances that apply to buildings constructed before 1985. This building was built in 1954. Every single one of your eviction notices violated rent control protections. The truth was about to surface in ways Marcus Rothwell never anticipated. But what disturbs me most, Judge Caprio continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is this. He held up a photograph. This photo was submitted by Mrs. White's neighbor. It shows Summit Eviction Services throwing Mrs. White's belongings onto a snow-covered sidewalk at 6:30 a.m. on December 23rd. The temperature was 12 degrees. Mrs. White, 80 years old, is standing in her nightgown on her own front steps, watching 60 years of her life being thrown into garbage bags. He looked directly at Marcus Rothwell. you did this 2 days before Christmas. You traumatized an 80-year-old woman whose only crime was living in an apartment she'd called home for longer than you've been alive. And then, and this is what stuns me, you had the audacity to sue her for $25,000 for trying to salvage her wedding photos from a dumpster. Rothwell's jaw tightened. Your Honor, this is a business decision. Sentimentality doesn't pay bills. Real estate development requires difficult choices. Difficult choices? Caprio's voice finally showed the anger he'd been restraining. Let me tell you about difficult choices, Mr. Rothwell. Difficult choices are what Mrs. White faces every month when she decides whether to buy groceries or her heart medication on an $100 pension. Difficult choices are what she faced when she had to bury her husband of 60 years and decide whether she could afford to stay in the home where they'd built their life together. He stood, papers in hand. What you made was not a difficult choice. It was a cruel one. It was a calculated decision to maximize profit by exploiting legal technicalities and timing your evictions to avoid legal challenges. You weaponized the legal system against the most vulnerable people in our community. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Here's my ruling, Judge Caprio said. First, the eviction of Eleanor White is declared null and void. The eviction was conducted without proper notice, without a court order, and in violation of rent control ordinances. Mrs. White is hereby reinstated as the legal tenant of apartment 3B at 247 Waterman Street. Eleanor gasped, her hand going to her mouth. Second, her rent shall remain at $680 per month for the duration of her natural life. This rent control protection will be enforced by court order and recorded with the property deed. Any attempt to raise her rent, harass her, or constructively evict her will result in contempt of court charges. Rothwell's face went red. Your Honor, you can't... I'm not finished, Caprio said coldly. Third, I am imposing a fine of $2 million on Rothwell Properties for the illegal eviction of 34 families. This money will be distributed equally among the displaced tenants as compensation for your violation of their rights. Fourth, you will pay Mrs. Eleanor White $50,000 in damages for emotional distress, property destruction, and the trauma you inflicted. Fifth, I am referring this case to the Rhode Island Attorney General's office for investigation of fraud regarding the $12 million in affordable housing tax incentives you received and failed to use as intended. Marcus Rothwell stood, his composure finally shattered. This is outrageous. I'll appeal this immediately. You're overstepping your authority. Sixth, Caprio continued, as if Rothwell hadn't spoken. I am ordering a full audit of all Rothwell Properties holdings in Rhode Island to investigate the 78 tenant rights violations on record. Any properties found in violation of housing codes will be subject to immediate fines and potential receivership. And seventh, Judge Caprio said, his voice softening as he looked at Eleanor, I am issuing a restraining order preventing Rothwell Properties or any of its agents from contacting Mrs. White directly. All communication must go through the court. He set down his gavel. Mr. Rothwell, let me explain something to you. In my 37 years on this bench, I've seen a lot of people who mistake wealth for wisdom, power for righteousness. You own 2,400 apartments, but you don't understand the first thing about what a home means. Caprio gestured toward Eleanor. This woman lived in that apartment for 42 years. She celebrated 42 Christmases there, 42 New Years. She nursed her children through chickenpox and homework and teenage heartbreak in that apartment. She held her husband's hand as he took his last breath in that apartment. That's not just property, Mr. Rothwell. That's a life. That's history. That's sacred. You can buy buildings, but you can't buy what makes a place a home. You can hire expensive lawyers and wear expensive watches, but you can't purchase decency. And you certainly can't buy your way out of the consequences of cruelty. Rothwell's attorneys began gathering their papers, but Rothwell himself seemed frozen. Money can buy comfort, Judge Caprio said quietly, but it can never buy class. You proved that today. He looked at Eleanor, and his expression softened completely. Mrs. White, you can return to your home. The court will ensure your belongings are restored, and any items destroyed will be compensated from the damages award. You have my word that no one will force you from your home again. Eleanor White, 80 years old, who'd spent Christmas in a homeless shelter, who'd watched her wedding china shatter on a frozen sidewalk, who'd pulled her husband's photographs from a dumpster, began to cry. But this time, they were tears of relief. Her daughter Karen rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her mother. In the gallery, several people were crying too. One elderly man in the back row started clapping, and soon the entire courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Caprio had to bang his gavel 3 times to restore order, but even he was smiling slightly. Marcus Rothwell and his attorneys left the courtroom in silence. As he passed Eleanor, she looked up at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The judgment spoke for itself. What happened next shocked everyone in Providence's real estate community. The Attorney General's investigation took 6 months. They discovered that Marcus Rothwell had used the $12 million in affordable housing incentives to purchase luxury properties in Newport and Block Island instead. He'd falsified development plans and bribed 2 city officials to approve the tax benefits. The fraud charges carried a potential sentence of 15 years. Rothwell Properties was forced to sell off 70% of its holdings to pay the fines, legal fees, and settlements. The company's value dropped from $840 million to $190 million in 8 months. But the real change came in the law. Eleanor's case became the catalyst for the Rhode Island Tenant Protection Act of 2025, signed into law by the governor on June 15th. The new law required 180-day notice for evictions in buildings purchased by new owners, banned evictions during holidays and extreme weather, and created a tenant legal defense fund financed by a tax on luxury real estate developments. The building at 247 Waterman Street never got demolished. The city of Providence purchased it using eminent domain and converted it into permanently affordable housing. Rent is capped at $700 for existing tenants, $850 for new tenants. All 34 original families were offered the chance to return. 28 accepted. Eleanor White still lives in apartment 3B. She's 81 now. Her rent is still $680. Every Christmas Eve, the tenants of 247 Waterman Street gather in the lobby for a party. Eleanor bakes her famous snickerdoodle cookies, the recipe Raymond loved, and tells stories about the building's history to the younger families who've moved in. Last Christmas, someone hung a small plaque in the lobby. Eleanor White Community Housing, where justice made a home. Judge Frank Caprio attended the dedication ceremony. When asked by a reporter why he'd ruled so harshly against Rothwell, his answer was simple. Justice cannot have 2 standards, one for people with money and one for people without. The law exists to protect the vulnerable, not to be a weapon for the powerful. Compassion isn't an exception to justice, he added. It's the purpose. If this story touched your heart, if you believe judges like Frank Caprio represent the best of our justice system, please support our new channel by subscribing and liking this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that justice and compassion can coexist. Comment below with your city. Let's build a community that believes in fairness for all. Marcus Rothwell eventually pleaded guilty to fraud and tax evasion. He served 18 months in federal prison and was ordered to pay $8.7 million in restitution. Upon release, he sold his remaining properties and moved to Florida. He never returned to Rhode Island. But Eleanor White? She's still there, in the home she's occupied for 43 years now. On warm evenings, she sits on the front steps with her neighbors, watching children play in the street. Sometimes her grandchildren visit, and she shows them the photo albums, the ones she rescued from the dumpster, now carefully restored and preserved. In one photo, taken in 1982, a young Eleanor and Raymond stand in front of 247 Waterman Street on their moving day. They're holding hands, smiling at the camera, ready to start their life together in apartment 3B. 43 years later, she's still there, still home, and every Christmas Eve, at exactly 6:15 a.m., the time she was evicted that freezing morning, Eleanor lights a candle in her window. Not in mourning, but in celebration. A reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, justice wins. Sometimes the courtroom really is the great equalizer. Sometimes compassion and law walk hand in hand. And sometimes, an 80-year-old woman with nothing but her dignity and the truth can stand up to a billionaire and win. Because in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, and in courtrooms like his across America, one truth remains constant. Every person deserves to be treated with respect. Every home deserves to be protected. And every act of cruelty, no matter how legal it appears, will eventually face the scales of justice. Eleanor White is home, and that's exactly where she belongs.